The last years of World War II left Europe exhausted and torn apart by conflict. It had become commonplace to find entire cities among the rubble. The number of casualties had already accumulated into millions, and humanity's perception had darkened. Each day was a struggle for survival, as the conflict claimed lives and eroded people's morale. The end of the conflict marked a long and tortuous path, punctuated by momentous events that altered the course of history. It began with the Normandy landings in 1944. Then came other milestones such as the liberation of Paris, the discovery of the extermination camps, Hitler's suicide, and the fall of Berlin. To better understand this fragment of history, we invite you to watch our video today. We'll review all the events that marked a before and after in global geopolitics. Let's begin.
The worst thing for me, I would think, it made you think that, my God, how could God let this happen? You know, it tests of faith, but of course, I never lost my faith. I don't think any of us ever did. But how could people do that? You know, you had to be an animal to do things like that.
By the end of the year 1944, the situation in Germany was devastating. In the final stages of the war, although there were no longer clearly defined Eastern or Western fronts, there were still soldiers willing to resist until the end. Despite the increasing shortage of weapons, ammunition, and fuel. Those born in 1926 or later were known as the Flakhelfer generation, as they had grown up in the Hitler Youth. Also known as flak helpers, they were responsible for assisting with anti-aircraft defense from a young age. Due to their complete indoctrination under the Nazi regime, they were seen as the last fervent soldiers, even fanatics, willing to sacrifice themselves in defensive battles and in the final confrontations. It was common to see 16 or 17-year-olds in oversized uniforms with rolled-up sleeves, fighting not only for their country, but for the only regime they had known. Currently, historians estimate that more than 1 million uniformed personnel died between January and May 1945. That is to say, the last 130 days of the Second World War in Europe represented a third of all German soldiers killed in combat. The desperate resistance also resulted in heavy losses for the Allies, especially in the Red Army, where hundreds of thousands fell in the final year of the conflict. During the same period, their air attacks intensified. This was notable in the last year when many German cities suffered the most devastating bombings of the entire conflict. Almost 500,000 tons of incendiaries were dropped on German territory in 1945, surpassing the total for all of 1943. Although the exact number of casualties remains undetermined, estimates suggest around 115,000 deaths, mainly civilians. By the end of the war, 1/5 of all households in the German country were destroyed. Now let's review the most crucial events that changed the course of this war history. First, let's go back to mid-44 when the famous D-Day occurred. The Normandy landings represented a crucial milestone in World War II. Carried out by the Allied forces led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, This bold move aimed to assault the German forces occupying France. After intense preparations carried out over a year, the original date set for D-Day was June 5, 1944. However, adverse weather conditions forced a postponement of the operation to the following day. Thus, on June 6th, the Americans carried out a coordinated landing on 5 beaches in the French region, known as Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Although German military leaders anticipated an offensive, the initial attacks were underestimated, considering them simple diversionary tactics. The resistance was fierce, and the advance through the narrow streets of Normandy's towns and cities was tough. Nevertheless, the numerical and aerial superiority of the Allies eventually allowed them to break through the enemy lines, though the human cost was extremely high. It is estimated that around 4,414 Allied troops died on the day of the landing, with a total of approximately 10,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. For the German forces, it is estimated that there were between 4,000 and 9,000 casualties. 2 weeks later, on June 22, 1944, the Russians launched a massive offensive in eastern Belarus, triggering a series of events that would mark the beginning of the end for the Nazi government. This offensive was not only a military triumph, but also a psychological blow to Hitler's forces, which until then had maintained an apparent superiority on the Eastern Front. During this operation, known as Bagration, the Soviets managed to destroy the center of the German army group, inflicting massive losses on the enemy and disrupting their defensive lines. The Russian advance was relentless, and they quickly reached the Vistula River, facing Warsaw, in the heart of Poland. 2 months after Normandy and the offensive in Belarusia, one of the most crucial liberations of the entire war took place. The City of Light, a symbol of art and freedom, had been under German occupation since 1940, until in August 1944, the Nazis finally surrendered. This occurred following the arrival of Marshal Philippe Leclerc and his men, who advanced from Normandy towards the French capital. Initially, Adolf Hitler had ordered the destruction of Paris, but his orders were disregarded by a senior German officer, General Dietrich von Choltitz. This change of plans was due to the influence of his subordinates, who were convinced that the destruction of Paris was not strategically necessary and that preserving the city would be more beneficial politically and diplomatically. The internal struggle of the Parisians, along with the arrival of Allied forces, triggered a series of street confrontations in which French troops and the resistance fought against the retreating German forces. Finally, the Nazis surrendered. Although the liberation of Paris was costly, with approximately 10% of the 2 million Allied soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, this event marked another significant milestone in the fight against Nazi occupation. Furthermore, it paved the way for the subsequent defeat of the Third Reich and the restoration of emancipation in Europe. On August 25th, the feast day of Saint Louis, patron saint of France, Paris joyfully welcomed the liberating troops. The Parisians, many of them having not slept, greeted with joy the tanks of French General Paul de Langlade and the armored vehicles of Leclerc, who established their headquarters at the Gare Montparnasse, a symbol of the rescued city. On August 23, 1944, 2 days before the liberation, a crucial moment occurred in Eastern Europe when Soviet troops advanced to the Prut River on the border of Romania and Moldova. This advance led the Romanian opposition to overthrow the regime of dictator Antonescu. The political change led to an armistice and an immediate switch in sides in the war by Romania, which had previously paid homage to Hitler. The geopolitical realignment prompted Bulgaria to surrender on September 8th, while the Germans were forced to evacuate Greece, Albania, and southern Yugoslavia in October. This shift in allegiances in Eastern Europe was a devastating blow to the Axis forces and marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. Hitler was beginning to lose more and more territorial power. On September 4, 1944, Finland decided to sign an armistice with the Soviet Union and expel German forces, reflecting a change in political and military dynamics in Northern Europe. The death marches, as they are known, were part of the Nazis' attempts to evacuate concentration camps before the arrival of Allied forces, in order to hide evidence of their crimes and prevent the liberation of prisoners. The SS initiated the evacuation of Auschwitz and its satellite camps, forcing approximately 60,000 prisoners to undertake these deadly marches. Thousands were killed in the days leading up to it, and tens of thousands, mainly Jews, were forced to walk to the city of lSlS in western Upper Silesia. During these days, SS guards shot those who fell behind or could not continue. In lSlS, the prisoners were loaded onto unheated freight trains and deported to concentration camps in Germany, such as Flossenburg, Dachau, and Mauthausen. However, there were camps like Auschwitz, where hundreds of thousands of prisoners remained trapped. Winter brought hopeful news on January 27th, when Russian troops liberated the largest concentration and extermination camp created by the Nazis. In April 1945, Hitler's and Nazism's defeat became clear as the Allies closed in on the Third Reich by land and air. In a desperate attempt to halt the advance of enemy forces, the strategy of setting fire to German cities, including the capital Berlin, was implemented. This devastating plan was carried out by the Nazis, who destroyed key infrastructures and caused massive fires to hinder the American advance. The arrival of Soviet troops at the gates of Berlin marked the beginning of the last major battle between the Nazis and the Allies. This confrontation lasted from April 23 to May 2, 1945, and was one of the bloodiest and most ferocious episodes of the entire Second World War. The streets of the capital became deadly battlefields where fierce combat was waged. During those same days in Italy, on April 28, 1945, the execution of Benito Mussolini took place. Just a few days earlier, the partisans had liberated Milan and Turin. The dictator was executed in Giuliano, a civil parish of Mezzegra, while the other fascists captured with him were taken to Dongo and killed there. On April 29th, Rodolfo Graziani, Mussolini's right-hand man in Africa, surrendered all fascist armed forces in Caserta. The news of Mussolini's execution led Hitler to swear that he would not suffer a similar fate. The note of the Führer's suicide is part of a set of telegrams that mark the end of the Third Reich. The document, dated April 24, 1945, records the Nazi leader's final decision to stay in Berlin to face what he called the decisive battle for Germany. This telegram is Hitler's response to Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, who the day before had urged him to leave the bunker and leave the country. However, the Führer reaffirmed his determination to remain in Berlin and participate in the battle, considering that his presence there would set an example for others. Hitler ended his life in his bunker at the Reich Chancellery. The top Nazi leader made the decision after what he considered an attempted betrayal by Heinrich Himmler when negotiating with the International Red Cross. That same night, the Führer decided to marry Eva Braun, a young photographer from the Nazi Party, 23 years his junior, inside the bunker. At 3:30 p.m., the Nazi leader and his wife met in front of the map room and said goodbye to their assistants. After closing the door, a single shot was heard. That of the Führer's pistol. Eva Braun had decided on her own to take her own life by taking cyanide. Later, the bodies of both were wrapped in carpets and taken to the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery. They were doused with around 200 liters of petrol, taken from cars still in the basement of the building. The news of the death of the man, considered the personification of absolute evil, was received with disbelief by many, a distrust that persisted for decades. One day later, Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, died. First, he ordered that his children be poisoned. Then, he and his wife committed suicide. Unlike Hitler and Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, the second highest-ranking official of the SS, attempted to avoid his fate by negotiating with the opposing side. He sought immunity in exchange for the Nazi surrender, but the Allies rejected his offer and included him in the list of most wanted war criminals. Himmler opted for a false identity, but his attempt to go unnoticed failed when British soldiers detained him at a border checkpoint on May 22, 1945. Although he carried a new passport, his true identity was revealed during interrogation the following day. In a moment of desperation, during a medical examination, Himmler bit into a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. 15 minutes later, he succumbed to the poison. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Lüneburg Heath. It happened in Reims, at the headquarters of the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This surrender took effect on May 8 at 11:01 p.m. The same day the official surrender of Berlin took place. It had been 426 days since the historic Normandy landings, and it seemed that World War II had come to an end. However, there was still one last gasp to witness. It was on August 6, 1945, when the world was shaken by an unprecedented act. The B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning. The impact was devastating, with over 140,000 people killed, thousands injured, and long-lasting repercussions. The city was reduced by 90%. Days later, Nagasaki suffered a fate similar to Hiroshima's. This tragic event occurred after an ultimatum issued by the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and the former USSR to the Japanese government. the Allies demanded unconditional surrender or face annihilation. On another front, in the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese adopted a defensive tactic that concentrated their forces in the southern part of the island, where they erected a fortified line known as the Shuri Line. Despite a relatively quiet initial landing, American soldiers encountered stubborn and well-organized resistance. The Shuri Line was composed of a series of bunkers, caves, and trenches that stretched from coast to coast. In an attempt to break this resistance, Allied commanders concentrated the fleet's cannons and conducted intense bombardments on Japanese positions. This fierce opposition, combined with the difficult terrain of the island, turned the Battle of Okinawa into one of the bloodiest and most brutal of World War II. The surrender of the city finally took place on June 21, 1945. At 7 o'clock in the evening of this day, the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, summoned journalists to announce a momentous event. Japan had surrendered unconditionally.
We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won.
After 6 years of conflict and an immeasurable human cost of at least 60 million lives lost, World War II was coming to its conclusion. The news spread rapidly throughout the world. In Times Square, New York, the illuminated headlines announced the surrender, triggering a tumultuous celebration in the streets with 2 million people. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee interrupted the nation's sleep to confirm the victory over the radio, proclaiming that the last enemy of the free world had been defeated. These were the main events that marked the end of the Second World War. If you wish to explore further this dark period of humanity, we invite you to subscribe and share your comments. We look forward to seeing you in the next installment of Military History. Thank you very much.